And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, good morning once again. I'm glad you're joining us for our online service here at First Congregational Church of Houston. What an interesting time we're living in. I'm sure we'll all have lots of stories to tell about our experiences during this pandemic. And this week, I'll have yet one more opportunity to practice my skills at being a televangelist. Being someone who didn't grow up watching televangelists, I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to be doing this. And so I could use some tips. Do I need more emotion? More hand gestures? How do you think I'm doing? This morning, I'd like to talk about epistemological crises. I know it's probably a common thing for televangelists to talk about epistemological crises. I bet Kenneth Copeland was talking about it right after he was blowing away coronavirus a few weeks ago. But still, some of you might be wondering, what on earth is that? What is an epistemological crisis? Well, epistemology is just a fancy word derived from Greek, which means the study of truth claims. It's a branch of philosophy that asks the question, how do we know what is true or valid? All of us, whether we're conscious of it or not, have methods we use to evaluate what's true. How do we know what or who to trust in the world around us? How do we formulate our assumptions about right and wrong? What do we base it on and why? Epistemology. And all of us at some point or another in our lives run into epistemological crises. These are those moments when what we have assumed to be true gets shaken. We don't know how to think about our world anymore. We lose our way. Our normal bearings don't seem to give us much direction. You know what I mean? An epistemological crisis hit my high school friends this past week. It was Tuesday, and I was minding my own business, working away at home. Suddenly, my phone started to blow up. One text after another. They kept coming. I glanced down to see what the commotion was. It was a text group that I'm in with my high school friends. Clearly, something serious had happened. I took a deep breath and opened the text exchange. Immediately, I saw what the issue was. Rob Gronkowski, aka the Gronk, aka the best tight end in NFL history, was coming out of retirement in order to play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Wow. So not only do the Patriots fans lose Tom Brady to the Bucs, this happens. The Brady loss was tragic, shaking even, but most Pat fans knew that it was coming or something like it. But for Gronk, the Gronk, to come out of retirement and then leave the Pats, all for a fourth-round draft pick? It was too much to handle. The world didn't make sense anymore for my high school friends. What now? What is true? How to go through the world? They were adrift, lost in the waves of NFL personalities. It was an epistemological crisis. This week, and indeed these past couple months, have seen their fair share of epistemological crises. The advent of the coronavirus, affectionately termed Miss Rona by internet memes, has upended many of our assumptions about the world. After all, how else can we explain the popularity of the Netflix documentary Tiger King? Nothing seems to make sense anymore. So why not spend 7 hours swimming in an oddly polluted pool of big cat culture? Watching Joe Exotic accuse Carol Baskin of murder makes a lot more sense than the world being brought to its knees by something we can't even see. Now, some assumptions that have been shattered, I have to admit, I'm happy to see go. In America today, there is a whole group of people who call themselves libertarians. They believe, quote, the government which governs least governs best. They feel that the market, unencumbered by any regulation, is a near deity. For these libertarians, the market is the answer to everything. You hear them complain about government all the time. And they are so fanatical in their devotion to the God of the free market that they often obscure situations where they are right by their very insistence that the free market must answer absolutely everything. Well, enter stage left, Miss Rona. The coronavirus has shown, once again, that there is a real and necessary role that government plays. The free market is not the answer to everything. These very same libertarians who decry the government are the first people in lines with their hands out when this crisis hit. I hope that this moment does lead to an epistemological crisis for libertarians so that they can see that what we need is good government and not no government. We'll see if that actually comes to pass. And there certainly are scary epistemological crises during this time as well. I think of the eerie drop in oil prices this past Monday. Oil contracts traded at a negative price. What does this mean for life as we know it in Houston? How bad will it get? Will our homes be worth anything? Will people have jobs? We've become so accustomed to a life buoyed by oil. What happens when that's not the case anymore? Especially for those in the industry, it can shake the very foundation of what makes sense in the world. But the epistemological crises that affect us most are always those that are deeply personal. You're all set to have a promotion at work, only to find out that you don't. All the signs from your boss and comments from your colleagues that you rely upon to figure out the world seemed positive. Then someone backstabbed you. Something happened. Your boss doesn't think as highly of you as you assumed. Your whole life at work has been thrown into confusion. Who to trust? What to think? Are you actually doing a bad job? You go to the office and it seems suddenly strange, like a foreign country. When my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, my mother's world was sent into a tailspin. Never in her wildest dreams had she ever thought that my father would be the first of them to die. My father's family had the good genes. Everyone in his family lived forever. The opposite was true in my mother's family. My father was in good health. Everything seemed okay. He was 58 years old. And then the diagnosis came. The prospect of my father's death, and then his absence when death came, shook my mother's foundations. Who was she if not a spouse and a caregiver? After over 30 years of marriage, what happens when you're suddenly alone? How do you structure your life, your day? How do you know death won't come for you tomorrow? You walk through the world in a daze. Nothing seems to make sense. Everything feels unreal. The disciples in our text for this morning experienced a similar epistemological crisis. Yes, they had lost their friend and teacher. That was shocking enough. Any loss, especially if someone so close, shakes our assumptions about the world. But the disciples had other things to wrestle with as well. They had given up their former lives to follow Jesus. So now what? What were they supposed to do now that he was gone? His death also shook their understanding of God. How could God let Jesus die? Jesus was an innocent man. He was tortured to death by the Roman Empire in collusion with the religious establishment. So where was God? Why did God not stop it? What to make of Jesus' teachings and his miracles now that he was dead? Can you see how earth-shattering this must have been for the disciples? What's true? What's up? What's down? All of these epistemological crises, these moments that shake our very foundations, leave us adrift and confused. As human beings, we need some direction. We need certain truths that we can rely upon in the world. I need to know that if I work hard, I'll still have a job. If I'm kind to others, they'll be kind to me. If I make my bed in the morning, it will be made for me at night. But what do we do when the truths that we rely upon fall apart? How do we find a way forward? These events happen to us in the course of our lives. For many, the coronavirus is forcing them upon us now. How do we piece things back together after an epistemological crisis? Well, Luke 24 provides us with an answer. Here are two disciples making the walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away. As they're walking along, a stranger comes up to them and begins talking with them. The stranger asks them a simple question: "So what are you guys discussing?" They look at him like he's on another planet. Well, they were talking about Jesus of Nazareth, who was killed. The whole city was talking about it. They relayed a summary of what happened and expressed their utter dismay. The report from the tomb that morning has left them even more confused and lost. Now, at this point, Jesus, who was the person walking along with them, could have made himself known to them. He could have done it that way. He simply could have allowed them to see him, as he did later on when he was sharing a meal with them that was known to them in the breaking of the bread. But he didn't do that. He didn't reveal himself earlier on. He did something else instead. And did you notice it? Jesus instead walks them through the scriptures and shows them how his death makes sense when you read the Old Testament in a new way. Before they can recognize Jesus, he makes sure that they have a narrative that makes sense of his death. He meets them in their epistemological crisis and helps them create new meaning of their lives by virtue of narrative. Think about that for a moment. We all use narrative to make sense of our world and our own place in it. Our identity is made up of narratives. We are the son or daughter of particular parents, and we interpret that and what that means in particular ways that give us an identity. We have a role amidst our family and friends. We are someone who loves, who provides. We're someone who's the funny guy or the one who organizes everything for the group. We're the person you can call on when you need help. We're Americans or Houstonians. These labels have particular narratives that gives them coherence and meaning. Narrative is the key to our identity. So when our identity is thrown off, when our assumptions about who we are or what our world is like or who others are gets thrown off in an epistemological crisis, our first task and most important task is to recreate a narrative for ourselves. That is the way we find a path forward. That is the way we make new meaning for ourselves and our world. We make narratives that are intelligible based on what happened, which is precisely what Jesus does with his disciples on that road to Emmaus. And when the disciples look back on that process, on that recreating of a narrative, their hearts burned. They burned with the truth of the Holy Spirit working within them. Now think back to those times when you have experienced an epistemological crisis. Do you remember what happened? How you felt? How confused the whole world was? Then think about how you were able to find a new way forward. What did you do? I would bet that it involved, on some level, the recreating of narratives, a refashioning of who you are. For my mother, in the wake of my father's illness and death, she had to create a new narrative for herself as a widow. Now that means different things to different people. My mother decided that for her, having someone else in her life mattered. She was the type of person who needed and wanted a life partner. That narrative of who she was and what she needed led her on to focus on that as her life goal. And she was blessed to find a wonderful husband. But others respond in different ways. My grandmother, for instance, could not see herself with someone else after my grandfather died. She had plenty of options, but she decided that she was always going to be Mrs. Gilman Conant. And she made peace with that identity. When you don't get that promotion at work, how do you respond? What narrative do you create? Are you someone who's been wronged? Who sees others as everyone who's out to get you? Are you someone whose sense of personal pride doesn't allow you to work at the same firm anymore? Or are you someone who refashions your narrative as something else? Perhaps you realize that you were putting too much focus on work, and you want to recreate your identity as the loving parent who is present at all your children's activities. It comes down to narrative, just like in our text for this morning. The same thing happens when we have an epistemological crisis with God. Think about it. For many of you, you grew up in a more conservative religious environment. You were told that the Bible was the inerrant word of God, that the world was created in 6 days. You were given tools to defend yourself against unbelievers. You had a narrative of faith and a narrative of God that made sense. Then something happened that shook your faith. Maybe you started to doubt miracles. Or perhaps your learning of science made you question things in the Bible. Perhaps it was your prayer life. You kept praying for one thing or another, but it didn't come to pass. Why not? For many people, epistemological crises with God happen as a result of suffering. Someone dies who shouldn't die. Where was God? Over time, you develop a new narrative of faith. You realize that the Bible does not have to be literally true. You can see the discontinuity between Jesus' radical teachings and the teachings of your church or pastor. Eventually, you create a new narrative of God that makes sense with other narratives that you have about your life. Now, for me, wrestling with being gay and Christian led to an epistemological crisis of faith. Like most Christian gay kids, I prayed that I could be straight. I wanted that straight nuclear family. I wrestled with what the Bible said, or supposedly said, about gay people. For many young gay kids, the epistemological crisis of faith leads them to decide either to be closeted and self-loathing or to give up on God and faith altogether. There is no way for these kids to recreate a narrative that includes both Jesus and the Bible and somehow also makes room for being gay and all that that entails. This is where I wish I could talk to these kids about gay theology, about new ways of reading the Bible, and new ways of conceiving of the body and desire. There is a way forward, but it requires a new narrative for it to make sense. Then that new narrative must make our hearts burn, as the disciples' hearts burned when Jesus restructured their narrative. So where do we find ourselves today? Today, as we sit in our homes and apartments with our old lives upended or at least on hold. We find ourselves in the midst of a crisis that has forced us out of our habits and customs. In our pre-virus life, we could count on a particular routine every week. We knew it made us happy when we were sad. We had our own faith practices that grounded us in God. We had people around us whom we saw on a weekly basis. Then, all that came to a screeching halt. I don't know about you, but I have struggled to find a new routine and a new rhythm in this new world. The first few weeks of this crisis, if I were to be honest, filled me with anxiety. Over time, however, I've come to realize the opportunity that this crisis has brought. Before it all started, I had been complaining about how I structure my time, and now I have the chance to radically restructure it in ways that make sense for me and the work that I have to get done. I've come up with a new narrative for myself in this time of coronavirus. This week, now that I've shifted my focus, has been a revelation. I feel the most relaxed I've felt in months. In its own way, this virus has been a gift for me. And I see that now. Here at church, we've seen things get turned upside down as well. Before, we could count on service every Sunday and seeing the faces of those whom you know. I miss all of your faces. I miss seeing you on Sunday morning in person. I miss shaking your hands after service and hearing about how you're doing. I miss singing as a corporate body. I miss church, and I'm worried. What will become of church? Will we still feel connected to one another and to God? Will we be able to add new members? Will we be able to make our budget? Like the disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, we feel lost and discombobulated. What is the role of a church without use of the building, without an organ, without meetings in person? This is where we can shift the narrative. We can reinterpret what's been going on. The reality is that the biggest growth periods of the church have always been when the church is under stress, when the old ways of doing things have been tossed out the window and we're trying to find our way. It happened in the early church. After Jesus' death, the church found a way to survive amidst persecution and to spread and thrive through house churches and by repeating and recrafting the stories of faith. And then later on, when the church was becoming stale and institutional, the Desert Fathers and the founders of the monastic movement found a way to find God in nature, in radical community, in liturgy, in scholarship. It was those monasteries and those monks who kept the faith alive after the catastrophic fall of the Roman Empire. And it was during the Reformation, which marked, in many ways, the most corrupt and worldly that the church had ever been, when Martin Luther and dozens of other leaders preached that we could find our way to God with just the Bible and in a worshiping community. We didn't need the institution of the church to be followers of Jesus and to be reconciled to God. And we see other disruptions. We see them in the scientific revolution and how the church responded to industrialization. And now we see the church changing. It has been obvious for decades that the mainline churches needed to change. It's been obvious for decades that the mainline churches needed to be more tech savvy. Somehow we need to reach new people in new ways. We need to think about new ways of being church. They can reach people who actually want to hear our message because they are out there. We have been saying these things for decades, literally decades. But now we no longer have the luxury of carrying on church as we always have. We are being forced, through this virus, to develop new ways of connecting and worshiping and being together. How we face this time will determine whether the mainline church found its end on Good Friday or whether it really did meet Jesus on that road to Emmaus. Imagine how much farther we can spread our message and how many more people we can now reach. Imagine how much easier it would be to start new services to reach different audiences. What would happen if we can use this time to create a far more robust small group ministry than we could have before? This is a time when people are longing for connection with God. People want to know that God exists amidst all this craziness. People have been experiencing epistemological crises of all different sorts as a result of this current crisis. Imagine if we could use the narrative of faith to help people to make sense of it. Think of the ministry that could potentially lie before us. We all have crises that shake the very foundations of our being. We are all looking for a way forward. And perhaps Jesus has been walking with us all this time, and we didn't even know it. Maybe this is the moment when he breaks the bread and our eyes are opened to what God is doing among us, with us, beside us, even now. Maybe he is telling us a new narrative that will make our hearts burn.